think about what it means to make art, what it means to practice. What it means to do practice in general. What is practice? And specifically, what is practice in relation to photography? So, where do you start? But also, more generally, or more specifically, where do you start with your own work? How do you begin a project? Now, some of you might have an existing practice. Maybe it's every day after you brush your teeth, you go down to your studio or sit down to your desk and you do your practice, your art. In that case, that might be not so much of a question for you. You just carry on doing practice. But it's also possible that for some of you, it's a new thing to practice. It's a new thing to find yourself in an environment in which you are expected to practice as an artist. What does it mean? How do you go about it? And where do you start? So I think the question of where to start is deeply important, because whatever you choose as your starting point, you have already to take something for granted in order to make the first step. Because you have to start from somewhere, yeah? So you have to put your foot down in order to make the first step. But how do you know that you have solid ground under your foot? Maybe you are on the edge of a cliff, and if you put your foot down, there will be void, like in some cartoons, and you will just find yourself walking on thin air until you realize that there is nothing underneath, and you will fall down. So how, just to make this first step, you need to have certain certainty that there is something there to begin with. So the question is really not an obvious one, and not a trivial one, and relates both to how we are to start our journey, our seminars, and how you are to start your practice. Where exactly is it that you begin from? Anyone has any thoughts on that? Where do you begin from? Anyone has any thoughts? Yes, look.
Maybe the word practice, look at the history, the etymology of that word.
Sorry?
The etymology of the word practice.
The etymology of the word practice.
You can maybe drill into, okay, what's that? The history of that word.
The etymology of the word practice. But in terms of your own practice, where do you begin? What do you start from?
Your soul.
Your soul. So we already accept that there is a soul and there is a body, and we kind of enter the sort of a very specific setup that has a soul.
Okay, your inner being.
Yeah. Well, inner being is good, but what does it mean? Where the inner being starts from? So you called up your inner being. It appeared like this genie from the bottle.
It's your gut feeling.
Good. Yes. And how do you know that it is your gut feeling?
Because it happens for me at about 5 o'clock in the morning.
I think that's actually a very good answer, and it's a good sign. If it happens at 5 o'clock in the morning, it is probably the right thing. Why do you think 5 o'clock in the morning is a good time for something to happen?
It's the time between waking and sleeping.
Good. Excellent. Anyone else has any thoughts?
At the moment, like when you have a question, what is your practice? Why do you have this question right now?
From the question. We start from the question.
Because you don't have the question just out of the blue, or if you do, where the blue comes from.
Yeah, I mean that is also true, Sasha. I agree. Anyone else?
I feel like
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. That's fine.
I feel like the question is now always like very unclear. I feel like it's kind of baby in the womb, and then it'll grow until like the 10 months, and then you exactly know the moment. Okay, this baby going to born, and then you go to
But in terms of, you know, in very practical terms, you need to start working on this project. So you wrote a proposal. You need to start doing things. Where do you start from?
Maybe it's the drive, because I think we all are here because we have a drive to.
Yes, but what does it mean? What do you do? What do you do? Where do you start from?
You have an idea.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure idea is much better than the soul. They seem to belong to the same domain. Okay. What happens when you start from an idea? What happens when you start from an idea? I think it's an important thing to think about. You know?
Maybe you do some research, like not even like Googling, but maybe try to explore the idea.
But how do you know what to research?
Practical.
How do you know what to research? And I mean, normally that's what people will say. You have to first research your topic until you have an idea, and then you go into the studio and you make it. And that's okay if what you want to get out of this process is an illustration of an idea. Then you can work in this way. It will not get you an artwork, but it will get you somewhere. Yeah? Which might be all you need. But if you want to make a work of art, you need to sort of ask yourself, is starting from an idea really the way to begin? Is starting from research the way to begin? I'm not saying it isn't, but I think that's something you need to consider in relation to your practice. So as we see, a very trivial question about where do you start with your practice becomes kind of interesting. Anyone else has any thoughts? Yes.
So maybe it's about what's important to you.
How do you know what's important?
Well, that's the thing. You ask yourself, okay, what is important? And I think you just.
And what do okay, so you ask yourself,
What's important to me?
Look, what is important to you?
Community.
Well, I think that what is the thing that is most important to you?
Yourself.
I think it's right. I think the most important thing to look is look. Before community. Before anything else. The most important thing for me is myself. Okay, well that already puts us gives us a certain grasp of this problem.
But that's an assumption as well. I think some people, there are some rare cases where people put others first and others' lives first.
That's
It's
right.
very rare.
That's right. People sometimes put others first. In various situations, but how is that related to making art? Because we're not really talking here about, yes, I agree with you, there are various selfless acts of sacrifice and heroism, which we will actually examine later on in the course. But I think even in order to decide that you put the other first, you need to have the notion of the other, and that involves a very clear sense of self. Yeah. Okay. Good. There is some progress here. I mean, progress, but there is some movement. Anything else? Anyone else has some thoughts about where to begin and how to begin? So, you see, this is the curious thing about art and about thinking as an artist, about making an artwork. You need to somehow strip away the way you were taught to work. You were taught in school and later on in life in various work environments that indeed you have to start from an idea and then research. And once you have an outline or a plan, you can go and make it. And and when I teach students, when I help students with their research papers, that's exactly what I tell them to do. To research, to have a question, to write an outline, to collect their quotations. And for a research paper or a dissertation, these are effective strategies. None of that going to help you to make a work of art. Why that is the case will become a little bit clearer as we sort of try to understand what the work of art is. But let me just give you a very simple answer to the question, where do we need to begin? And the answer is this. You have to start from where you are. There is no other place where you could start. You have to start from where you are right now. Now, what do you mean by where you are? Will depend on you. Maybe you have stomach cramps right at this moment. That might be the starting point for your work. Come in. Do you think we have some room here? Could you just introduce yourself so everyone down here is tell us your name?
My name's Max.
And in a sentence to what are you working on, Max?
Working with 3D printed objects, I guess.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so the question is where to begin? And the tentative answer I propose, you must begin from where you are right now. Because the now is the time at which you start. And where you are, the place that you occupy right now is the starting point. Yes?
I have a question, because for me it's not, I don't start with an idea. For me it's like the urge to impress, like a feeling, or like, which is maybe in the beginning more like a color, or yeah, and so then you have associations with this feeling, and so then you start researching on, try to put them in places to understand what it means to you, or what you want from it. But if you don't understand what you want from it, what are you doing?
Well, you don't know what you're doing, and that's fine.
Okay. I don't know it right now.
That's fine, yeah. Well, if you want to be an artist, you have to get used to not knowing. If you want to know, you came to the wrong place. This is not about knowing, this is not about certainty, this is not about scientific facts. We already noticed that Heidegger spoke, with disdain about science for wanting to know everything and missing the most important thing that there is to know. Yeah. So the first point that we are putting on the table, which we're going to explore today in slightly greater depth, is that in order to start to figure out what is practice, we cannot follow the scientific model. We cannot follow scientific route. We need to develop another way of working. We need to develop another way of putting things together, which is not the logical, rational model. So, starting from a color or from a feeling, that's really all we can go by. That's all there is. And then what? And then how do you proceed? How do you know what color to put next to it? How do you know whether you need to take this line to the left or take this line to the right, or whether you need to lie on the floor or make a little dance, or how do you know what's next?
Don't you just do it?
You just do it. That's right. You just do it. And that's it. And that is a method. This is not meaningless. It is meaningful. It is meaningful in a different way. Okay.
How are we doing here?
So I'm going to approach this question of what does it mean to inhabit the space of an artist or the mindset of an artist through a slightly different direction. There is a very famous book by Thomas Kuhn, K-H-U-N. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Anyone heard of it? You heard of it? Yeah? You read it?
I've got it out. I haven't started reading it. But
Good. Yeah, great. Now, it's a very important book for many reasons. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, K-H-U-N. Thomas Kuhn was a sociologist of science, or a historian of science, and he wanted to understand how science moves on, you know? How does it happen that there is progress in science, you know? Now, the usual understanding, the traditional understanding, is that science grows incrementally. Yeah? So, you know, you do some experiments with the tools you have. Let's say you have a scale and you weigh things. Later on, you might have a digital scale and you can get more precise measurements. And if you have an optical microscope, then you can graduate to the electronic microscope and you see more detail. And the experiments, as the experimental knowledge gets accumulated, we understand more about the structure of the universe. And in this way, gradually, our knowledge grows. That is the typical understanding of how science moves forward, through gradual accumulation. But when Kuhn looked at some history of science, he realized that it is not at all the case. He realized that what happens is that for a very long time, scientists basically do the same thing over and over and over again. Scientists repeat the same experiments over and over and over again. And that can last for centuries. And nothing really grows much. Until at some point, someone, for whatever reasons that we're not going to get into at the moment, someone does a different experiment. This different experiment completely changes, gets completely different results. From that point onwards, loads of people start to repeat that experiment with slight modulations. So science doesn't gradually accumulate. It kind of sits in the same place for a long time, and then at some point there is a revolution happening. There is a shift happening. And it has a name for this revolution, for this shift. And make a note of it, because you can use it. It's a useful term to have on hand. The name is paradigm shift. Paradigm shift. You're probably familiar with this expression. It originates from Thomas Kuhn. Now, I give you an example of a paradigm shift, and then we can move to the text we wanted to read today and look at it, because I want to propose that, broadly speaking, the text is dealing with this question. The text is also dealing with the question of what does it mean to be an artist and what does it mean to practice. So we will see what Lyotard has to say about it later on. But since roughly Aristotle, anyone can place Aristotle chronologically?
500 BC.
500 BC, so roughly 2,500 years ago, yeah, give or take, yeah? And up to and including the 16th century, yeah, scientists operated with, science had a very specific way by which to understand the world. The world was divided into 4 main categories. Do you know what they are? Or 4 main qualities. And these were hot, cold, wet, and dry. These were the main categories, the key aspects of reality that Aristotle first formalized. And for almost 2,000 years, people referred to over and over again. So for instance, fire is hot and dry, earth is dry and cold, water is wet and cold, and air is hot and dry. Yeah? So that was quite a good, I mean, people sometimes think that only modern science deals with facts. It's not true. Science always deals with facts. And that was a very effective way to deal with the world. So we had to take a piece of wood, and we could say, well, wood has some wetness about it. It has some dryness about it. It has some hardness about it. Now, out of these 4 qualities, and these 4 qualities deal with the sublunar world, the world that is under the moon. There is another substance that is called the ether, or as sometimes it's called acquiescence. The ether. And the ether is the stuff that is between the stars. Yeah? But in the sublunar world, these 4 qualities, hot, wet, dry, and hot and cold, dry and wet, they seem to really help you grasp how everything is put together from these 4 components. They also translate this model of 4 components also translates to talking about the human body, because then you have the 4 humors. You have the black bile, the yellow bile, the phlegm, and something else. I'm missing one. Black bile, yellow bile, sanguine, and phlegm. Great. Yeah. So 4 humors of the body. Yes. Doctors spend infinite amount of time discussing these humors and trying to get them in balance. So if you come to the doctor and say, "Doctor, I'm not feeling well," they will examine you, they will look at the color of your urine, and they will say, "Okay, well, you probably have a deficiency of phlegm or blood bile or something like that. We need to take some blood out," or something like that. Yeah. So that was the methodology also for treating the human body. Yeah. So these are not lightweight matters. Yeah. Science was based on these principles for almost 2,000 years. Yeah. And all experiments and all knowledge was framed in these categories. Okay. Then, for whatever reasons, in one swift moment, scientists completely stopped talking about cold, dry, wet, and hot, and instead they start talking about velocity, speed, mass, weight, gravity, impenetrability, attraction, magnetism. That becomes the lexicon. No one mentions hot, cold, wet, and dry as if it was a bad dream. No one. Yeah? Now, what Kuhn says, and that's kind of quite interesting, he says, what actually happens when someone makes this new experiment that gets very different results? It's not that everyone now has sort of the veil removed from their eyes and say, "Oh my God, I was so wrong with my wet and dry stuff." No, the people who were doing the wet and dry and hot and cold, they continue doing it. They just gradually die out because they don't have disciples. They want to continue doing wet and dry stuff. Everyone wants to do the sexy new experiments that gives these new results. And people continue doing the new way of science, velocity, measuring velocity of things, measuring the gravitational pull, measuring mass, playing with vacuum and all of these things. Again, for a very long time, until at some point, and new things happen, and people start to talk about quantum physics, about quanta, and undecidability, and Higgs boson. And again, the people who continue doing the old Newtonian science gradually die out because no one wants to go to their lectures, basically. And no one wants to continue their life's work. And new way of making science emerges. So that's why this is interesting. There are a couple of points here that I think are quite salient. First, this notion that you have to be careful not to find yourself in this dying out breed, repeating the old experiment. Yeah? Because I think what Kuhn describes about science also applies very accurately to the world of art. Yeah? Artists like doing what other artists do. And they do it for a long time. You know, there's still people who probably, want to practice art in the same way it was practiced in the 19th century or in the 20th century. Yeah? But what happened? What is happening to you if you really inhabit the moment of the paradigm shift? If you, by some fortune or misfortune, find yourself living in this moment when hot, dry, cold, and wet stops being important, and everyone kind of, not everyone, and someone starts to make new experiments. Suddenly, there are different ways of working. I think it can be devastating for some people. Many people don't like that, not least because you are already invested. You spent many years in something. Perhaps you spent a lot of money on your education. You were hoping for a comfortable career, in the world of dry, wet, hot, and cold. And suddenly, it's kind of game over. People get very upset. Yeah. Though I think, and that's what Lyotard is talking about. Lyotard is basically saying this kind of paradigm shift moment is happening right now. And Lyotard is talking about his present. I'm not sure when this was written, but Lyotard did most of his work in the 70s and 80s. I think he died in 84 or 86, something like that. Anyone could check what year Lyotard died? Anyone has a device available? No? No.
In 1988.
1998, right. So then this text could be written in the 80s or 90s. Yeah, so kind of not that far from the moment we are in 1998. And Lyotard seems to believe that what is happening to art is a moment of paradigm shift. That is not the term he is using, it is a term I'm using, and this example from the world of science is the one I'm putting for you, not because that's how Lyotard is discussing it, but it seemed to me like a nice way to flesh out what is the nub of the argument. The nub of the argument for Lyotard in this essay is that we are now living in this paradigm shift moment. You can almost hear the sound of the gears shifting, you know, and it's kind of, it's a moment of tension. The question is, how do you adapt? How do you survive? What work can you make in this moment? Let's take 15-minute break, or I would prefer 10 minutes. I think I will not get to that in 10 minutes. Can we come back at 1:45? Sorry. Can we come back at 11:45? Yeah? Go back to So as I was saying, just to provide a bit of a context or a bit of a background to this little essay by Jean-François Lyotard, is that Lyotard is basically saying that the moment he is speaking from, as I said in the beginning, you can only start from where you are now. That is the starting point. And for Lyotard, the place where he is, the place that he inhabits, is a moment where a shift is happening. Now, that question of this shift occupied Jean-François Lyotard throughout his career as a philosopher, and he approached it in many different guises, most famous of which is his little book that is called The Postmodern Condition. The Postmodern Condition. This is the one book by this French philosopher you will find on the shelves of academics in the UK, especially in media studies courses, even in some photography courses. You might find this book by Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition. Because there he put his finger, or he thought that he puts his finger on something that is happening right now, at the moment of his writing. And he said what is happening is the old frameworks of thought are breaking down. These old frameworks of thought are breaking down in the same way that the framework of hot, cold, wet, and dry broke down in the beginning of the 17th century, or roughly around the time, and suddenly a new form of science emerged. We live with this new framework of science, and it's not only a scientific framework, it's also a framework through which we view the world aesthetically and philosophically and scientifically. This new framework is also now disintegrating one more time. And he called this moment of disintegration the post-modern, because the previous moment was known as the modern. Now, let's go into a little bit more depth into this question of the paradigm shift that happens in the beginning of modernity, and then we move to the postmodern one. Now, what do you think is happening in the 16th century to cause this shift from hot, wet, dry, and cold, and black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and what else? And suddenly, yeah. To talk about speed, mass, velocity, penetrability, gravity. What happened?
You entered the medieval period and the beginning of
Correct.
technology.
Correct. Yes.
Industry.
That's yeah.
I was going to say lenses.
Lenses.
It's a big technical, technological shift. So lenses allow different sort of
Well, yeah. I mean,
as part of it, not exclusive.
true. Many things happen all at once that cause a shift in many areas of life, not only in science, because this is what, if you've been to the Tuesday seminar, to the Tuesday lecture last week, this is what Immanuel Kant calls sapere aude, dare to know, to have the courage to use your own understanding. This is the moment where the framework of the medieval world breaks down and something new takes its place. What I want you to understand now, I mean, that I think is pretty clear. What I want you to understand now is that this shift is happening simultaneously in several areas, but it has something that holds it all together. And this something, I will explain to you in a minute why, and that's how we get into this text. This something has to do with the way representation operates. Now this is getting warmer. This is getting closer to what your practice is talking about. Now, so what does it mean to follow the Kantian idea, the Kantian maxim, sapere aude, dare to know? It means use your own reasoning, use the powers of your own intellect to grasp the world. Don't listen to the priest, don't listen to the doctor who will tell you that you need less blood bile in your body or something like that. Use your own, trust your own reasoning. A big ask, you know, and a scary thing to do. Because
Sorry, trust your own
reasoning.
reasoning.
Yeah, because it's like sailing in the sea but without a compass, without a navigator. How do you know where to go? Well, you are the only one who knows where to go. There's no one else to tell you. Yeah, why? Because there is no priest to tell you, unless you of course want to have a priest, but then you have to be the priest's servant or a slave. You know, if you want, let's say, the duke or the prince to tell you what to do, then yeah, but then you are a slave. If you don't want to be a slave, there is only one way to get it, and that is to be your own master. But that also means sailing the seas without anyone telling you where to go. So, a big ask, a scary thing. This is happening in simultaneously in several worlds, you know. But let's take the scientific moment, for example. Actually, no, I think there is something else that is happening roughly around this time, and that is there is a social change, and it's all these things are connected. But the social change that ultimately leads to the French Revolution suggests that people are not happy anymore to just be told what to do. People also want to have some say. You know, the reasons for that, if you have been to a history class, then you probably know the rise of the French bourgeoisie, the shift from agrarian society based on working the field to commerce. But why commerce became possible? Well, because suddenly there are better tools to navigate and to build fast ship. So you can feasibly send a fleet from the Thames, from the River Thames, to India to bring back tea and spices, and then you can set up the East India Trading Company. And then when you have trade instead of agriculture, people move to cities, people acquire certain wealth, but because of that, people also, because they are in the city, they are more likely to congregate in a central plaza or in a coffee shop and talk about how their feelings and perhaps form a political movement. Because as long as people work in their fields, you know, disjointed and everyone plows their little tract of land, there's not much connection. You cannot really build a political movement between people who just, you know, everyone in his own farm. But once cities become these magnets of commercial activity, politics also change because people talk, and then they get ideas, and then they can come to the streets like the levelers did during the English Revolution, and demand some rights, some representation in Parliament. And when the nobility or the king say, look, I don't want to hear anything about it, go back to your little huts, then people rise, they take up arms, they upset the king, they cut the heads off. So all these political changes are somehow interconnected with the scientific changes, because without the advances in navigation and in shipbuilding, which made possible by better understanding of how materials operate, the political changes will not happen. But there is another dimension to that, which is economic. During the Middle Ages, it's not like there was no money, but most of the economy was based on exchange. Yeah, I have some corn or wheat from my field. I can bring it to the market. I can exchange it for some chicken, even if in the process I exchange my wheat for some gold coins and then get something else for the coins. It's mostly this movement of goods. But once big commercial companies get established, like the East India Company in London, we're not talking anymore about accumulating some corn in my basement. We're talking about accumulating capital, yeah, which is a kind of abstract quantity of, for instance, gold in that case. And we also very quickly move into paper money, because gold, with all its sort of alluring and lucrative sheen, is very difficult to move around. So money appears. Yeah? Paper money. The interesting thing about paper money is that it is a piece of paper. It has no value. You cannot do anything with it. It's not a precious metal. It's a piece of paper. How come you, after a week of hard work, why do you agree to take home a piece of paper? Yeah? That is kind of ridiculous, isn't it? Because the piece of paper represents accepted value. Yeah? But isn't it a little interesting? Because this notion that paper representing certain value is kind of parallel to people demanding to be represented in the parliament. When people say, actually, we want that one of us will sit in the parliament with all the princes and the dukes and represent the bourgeoisie, the commercial people who live in the city, or the workers. When people seek political representation, at the same time, when money seems to be paper money, seems to be representing assets, and when exactly at the same time, when the scientific experiment represents the universal laws of the universe or nature, it looks like, I just want you to get the sense how this notion of representation seems to operate in many environments at the same time. In science, the experiment Newton conducts in his laboratory in Oxford, or Galileo, by dropping, let's say, a cannonball from the Tower of Pisa and measuring how long it takes for it to come down. The reason this experiment is valid is because it represents a universal law of nature. It can be repeated anywhere and you will be able to get the same result. So it is repeatable, but it's also universally applicable. It becomes a representation of something that happens also between the stars. It doesn't need to be in the same place. Do you understand this point? It's very important. Yeah? Then, paper money represents real assets. again, the point here is not the money and not the assets. The point here is that representation acquires a certain agency. A representation becomes the way through which things can be done. And in the political arena, people demand to be represented at the place where decisions are being made. People who previously had no political representation, because all the political decisions were made by the land aristocracy or the nobility, yeah, and not by the traders or the shopkeepers or the people who live and work in cities. But once the demand for political representation happens, then people, well, after a lot of bloodshed, eventually are able to elect their own representatives, and the representatives of the people can then represent them in the parliament. So here we see representation operating in all these domains. Now, how representation comes about as the main vehicle through which this change is happening, and what that has to do with the Kantian battle cry, sapere aude. Anyone has any thoughts about that? What is the connection between sapere aude and representation?
There is something to know. There's an underlying transcendental reality to know.
Yes, that's right. There is something to know, but it's very important how exactly this knowledge operates. This knowledge operates. Why can you be trusted to know? Why sapere aude is not a kind of, a hallucination, it's not a dream. Why it can actually work? Kant is saying it can work. You can figure out for yourself because you possess a specific tool with which you can do it. And this tool is called reason. Reason, in Latin ratio, or ratio, or rationality, is interesting. That the notion of the reason and rationality relates to the question of the ratio between things. What is the ratio between the cannonball and the feather? And the Greek word for the same thing is logos. Logos, ratio, reason. Logos is our logic as well. Because you have the ability to reason, to think logically, for that reason and for that reason only can you dare to know for yourself. Yeah? Not because you have faith, for instance, not because you have feelings, not because you have an instinct, not because you have a gut feeling, or a dream, or an unconscious urge, not because of that. Kant is saying the only reason you can know for yourself is because you can think logically. You can reason. Yeah? Now, this thinking logically is exactly what we call representation. To represent the world to yourself is to grasp the world rationally. That might not be immediately obvious why that is the case. Yeah? So let's just put it out there and we will later develop it a little bit more. To grasp the world rationally means to represent it. Now, that's where I think things get a little bit interesting because, after all, this is a photography master's course. And photography is traditionally and everywhere is seen as representation. You know, what photographers do, they represent. What is a photograph? Is a representation. And the most immediate question you ask yourself when you see a photograph is, what is the photograph of? In other words, what is represented in the picture? What I'm hoping to suggest to you is that this way of thinking about a photograph is historically connected to the moment where representation becomes the hinge on which the whole of society is hanging. Yeah? On which the economic dimension is hanging because money represents assets, on which the political dimension is hanging because people can elect their own representatives, and this is called representational democracy. Why is it called representational democracy? Because you elect the people who will represent you in parliament. Yeah? Now, in science, it is the experiment that represents the universal laws of nature. Then I can say H2O represents water. Okay? So, any questions so far? Queries, suggestions, doubts, anything? Yes?
So we were talking about different worlds in which representation became the hinge. What about in the art world?
Good. That is my next sentence. So, in the art world, exactly the same thing is happening. While the time frame might be a little bit different, perhaps in art, representation took footing, and that is very interesting. Listen to that. It could be that in art, representation had a foothold a little bit before science, politics, economics. Yeah, because Lyotard in the text says, painting obtained in status of nobility was placed among the fine arts, was given almost princely rights during the Quattrocento. What is the Quattrocento? The 14th century. Yeah? Sorry?
The 1400s.
The 1400s, the 15th century, that's correct, the 1400s, yeah. So, maybe 100 years before science. Now that might not be, that might be relevant because it could be the case that art has the ability to sense developments only later get articulated in politics, science, and economics and other areas. It is possible that as artists you might be able to see a little bit further. Why that is the case remains to be said, but I'm just throwing it out here for you because it is quite interesting. And so this is clearly not the 15th century, but it's a very typical example of an image that represents a certain reality. I mean, just as you can ask about a photograph, what is it of? You can ask that about this painting. Now, in the lecture on Tuesday, I showed you, for comparison, an icon from the Middle Ages, where the approach to the painting and its role was completely different. I'm not going to repeat that now, but in the world of art, as Tully was saying, yes? Tully, sorry. As Tully was saying, the notion of representation becomes another hinge. So we have
Sorry, what's the
a hinge.
hinge?
Yeah. So we have, for instance, Alberti, the Italian theorist of art, who writes in La Pintura that the role of the artist is to imitate reality in the most. The role of the artist, he says actually, is to completely remove the artist from the painting. So all we will see is the landscape. Yeah? The workmanship has to be so perfect that it becomes completely transparent. So before we move to the next point, what do you think is the collective name to these changes in science, economy, art, and politics that we discussed? Does it have a name? Enlightenment is one name, yes? The Renaissance is another one. Huh? Modernism is another one. Paradigm shift, yes, but I'm looking for the specific name for this thing. I think it might surprise you what I think is the name. The name is capitalism. And everything else you said is also correct. It is the Renaissance, it is the Enlightenment, it is of course a paradigm shift, but I suggest you think about it as this is the moment in history when capitalism makes an appearance on the scene. It's capitalism that makes the ship go faster, that brings commerce. It's capitalism that needs representation in order to operate. Take representation away from capitalism and it collapses. Yeah. Why that is the case will be something we can think about, and we will think about. But you can already get a bit of a sense that the question of art and the question of politics are not two separate questions. We don't need to ask how to make our art political. Art is political by dint of having a relationship to representation. Yeah? And there are only two options, there are several options here, but you can just let representation be the invisible force that operates behind, whatever it is you do. Or you can make an effort to put specifically this force on the stage of your work. So what makes a work of art political is not taking sides in the political debate, is not being a caricature, is not making explicit or implicit political statements. What makes an artwork political is the way it situates itself in relation to representation. Yeah? Okay, now that could have some interesting implications to your own practice, because you could go back straight away, think about even your proposal for Monday, and say, okay, how actually representation operates in what I proposed? Did they just rely on it to be there, my faithful friend, my loyal representational scaffold, in order to hang on it or everything I wanted? Or did I actually make representation a problem with which to deal, to come to terms with, to make friends with, to make enemies with? I don't know. That is an interesting question, and you could take the next step in your project along the lines of investigating what representation does in your work. Now, if you think this is an easy task, then think again. It's not an easy task. It is a complex, difficult ask, because as you're probably already getting the sense of, representation is enveloping us. in a way that is very hard to sense, you know, because when you hang a 10-pound note, you hand over a 10-pound note in a shop in exchange for 2 pints of milk and a loaf of bread. You don't consciously, okay, well now I'm going to engage in a certain representational ritual. I'm going to take these things and I'm going to give you a piece of paper that really has absolutely, you cannot eat it to do anything with it. And that will somehow work because the divine representation is just there, you know, in this moment to validate this transaction. Yeah? Take this validation away. Imagine that you want to do this transaction with someone